Hi, Year 12. So this is Wednesday's psychology lesson. So following on in terms of depression. So if you've got a bit out of sync and you haven't yet watched the introductory lesson on depression, then scrap this one and go back and do that. So if you are at that point, your retrieval is just to literally from memory identify as many characteristics of depression as you can in those three categories. Remembering those are the categories of characteristics that the DSM would use. Okay, so pause the video, write as many as you can. Remember behavior, what we would see, emotional, what they would feel, and cognitive, what they would be thinking, what would be going on in here. Okay, have a go. And hopefully you did. And I've literally, by way of answers, I've just copied that slide that I introduced you to in yesterday's lesson. So you can just check what ones of those you remembered. Emotional, low mood, anger, that's an emotion, isn't it? And we often see that in people with depression. Low sense of self-esteem, that self-loathing, self-hating feelings of emptiness. We can see, remember that difference when we look at the behavior, you can go one of either extreme. So really lethargic, no energy, or that psychomotor agitation, loss of appetite or increased appetite, insomnia or hypersomnia. Also that physical and verbal aggression. And I suppose that overlaps. That's an emotion. You feel anger, but then you act upon that anger. And that might lead to the self-harming or aggression towards others. And then cognitive, what's going on in here? Poor concentration, poor decision-making, those cognitive biases where you're focusing on the negative. We're going to really zoom in on that today and look at that in terms of explaining. And absolutist thinking. Everything is black and white. So if I've made a mistake, it's got to be a complete disaster, a catastrophe. We call it catastrophizing. It's a type of irrational thinking that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so make sure you're really confident on those different characteristics of depression. So a reminder again of your knowledge organizer that I shared with you in yesterday's lesson. And the bit that we're going to start really thinking about today is the explanations for depression. And there's two key names that we're going to need to really be confident on, Beck and Ellis. And we're going to dig a lot deeper with those two today. And it's going to involve looking at these cognitive biases as well. All right, so really important, those names and these key terms. So a bit of retrieval that's going to be necessary because we are now very much putting on our cognitive lens. So we're trying to explain why somebody would develop depression from a cognitive point of view. So again, pause the video, blank piece of paper, as much as you can remember about the cognitive approach, back from when we did it at the start of the year when we looked at our approaches. So keywords, ideas, names, go for it, okay? And this is just a selection of some of the things that I hope you would have included. You may well have had many, many more, depending on how many minutes you spent on that. Main premise or main assumption of the cognitive approach is that all of our behavior, whether that be normal or, as we're focusing on in this topic, abnormal behavior, is determined by our thinking. So we are what we think is that little catchphrase that we kind of remembered. And we remember that they use the computer analogy. So the idea that the brain is like the processing unit of a computer, input, process, output. Output is our behavior. So if we have abnormal behavior, it must be because there's some faulty processing going on. We know that we associate schemas with the cognitive approach. That's going to be important for us when we're thinking about depression, especially the self schema, the schema that you have about yourself. We know that a consequence of the cognitive approach is that development more recently of cognitive neuroscience led to things like artificial intelligence. We know that when we're dealing with cognitions, they are invisible. Your thought processes in there, I can't see them. So what I have to do is I have to use inference. I have to infer by looking at your behavior what might be going on in there. We know that's a problem. That can't be proved, can't be tested. And we know that whenever we're talking about cognitions, we're talking about any of those mental processes. So thinking, memory, perception, attention, all of these things are cognitions. And the cognitive approach, when it tries to explain any aspect of our behavior, will bring it back to those mental processes and will say, well, something is going wrong there if you've got abnormal behavior. In the case of depression, that's certainly what we're going to be thinking about. So here's a reminder, and I shared this with you at the time when we looked at the cognitive approach. So here's just literally a reminder of some of those definitions. Schema, those packages. Remember I said to visualize them as little boxes, and every time you have a new piece of knowledge or an experience, an emotion towards that thing, it goes into your little package. Now we need schemas. They are the way we interpret the world. It means every time we encounter something, we don't have to completely start from the beginning and learn it and familiarize ourselves with it. We just draw upon our schema. But we know that our schemas shape the way we interpret everything. So if we have a negative self-schema, and over the years, I have developed these negative thoughts about myself, and I've focused on any negative facts or negative feedback, then that negative self-schema will interpret everything I do, or so says the cognitive approach anyway. Okay, so we're going to start with Beck, really important name in the cognitive sphere of psychology. Okay, so Beck's theory, if you like, has different elements. So we could say there's 4 key points here that we've got. So first of all, we need to know the name. We need to know Beck, and we need to know that he says that you are vulnerable to depression because of the way you think. We'll see that in a minute. We need to know that Beck talked a great deal about faulty information processing. So this idea that your brain, as your processing unit of your computer, something's gone a bit wrong in there. It's faulty. And if we are, for example, focusing too much on the negative, always the glass is half empty, never half full, that negative thinking, then that will shape our behavior. And that will make us much more vulnerable to depression, Beck says. The negative self-schemas, I've just been mentioning that there, that's going to be very important for Beck's triad. And that brings me on to that. And Beck talked about a negative cognitive triad. Really important. It's on your knowledge organizer. I'm going to unpack it and explore it a bit more now. So you can see the graphic there. Remember, triad has 3 elements to it. So we're thinking, right, what 3 ways of thinking would lead somebody to become more depressed, or to become vulnerable, I should say, to depression? And Beck said, it's our thoughts about ourselves. It's our thoughts about the world around us, I mean, everything basically, and it's our thoughts about the future. And if we have negative thoughts, because of course we all think about those 3 things, but with depressed people, Beck says it's because their thoughts about those 3 things are negative that they are vulnerable to depression. So let's unpick each of those a bit more and try and tie in some of those other key terms we just talked about. If we focus first of all on the self, this is that self schema. We all have a view of ourselves, and it's shaped by our experiences, the feedback that we get from ourselves and from others, all of our achievements, things that we feel that we've succeeded in, but also things that we feel we failed at. And all of this, it builds up our self-schema, and we all have a self-schema. But Beck says, if you're thinking around yourself, if your self-schema is really negative, you've got those feelings that we know are characteristic of people with depression, of being, worthless, and nobody likes me, and I'm ugly, or I'm fat, or whatever, lots of different negative attitudes towards yourself. Beck says that's one of the reasons why somebody is depressed. Beck would argue there's no other explanation for depression. It's because you think depressive thoughts, and those thoughts might be around yourself, or they might be around generally the world around you, or they might be around your future, and this sense that there's no hope for the future. What's the point? It's an emptiness, a void. You can't look to the future. You can't set goals. It just seems totally pointless. We heard that from Stephen Fry. So if I come back to this idea of the world, our view, our way of thinking about everything is shaped by our thoughts. So says the cognitive approach. And often we hear people with depression talk about the world being empty, cold, hard. They view it as this sort of unpleasant place. They don't want to be part of it. And that often explains why they would withdraw or even have those suicidal attempts. And this negative view of the world can be made worse or can be explained by that absolutist thinking that we mentioned before. This idea that something is black or white, oh dear, I've made a mistake, oh, it's a catastrophe. We call it catastrophizing. And these are examples of faulty, irrational thinking. They're examples of cognitive biases. So Beck talked about these cognitive biases, and I've put a little screenshot of it there, and you've got it on your knowledge organizer, but we're going to unpack those a little bit more. So remember, these are examples of how somebody with irrational thinking is processing. It's faulty, and they think this can explain depression. So sometimes what we see in patients with depression is they will minimize some things and catastrophize or magnify other things. So if somebody said something positive, they've said, oh, you look lovely today, or you've had a small success, you've got a good score in a test. Someone with depression, according to Beck, what's causing their depression is they'll totally minimize that. They won't allow room in their brain for positive thoughts. They'll totally minimize any positives, any successes, and they will totally magnify any negatives. So we've got minimization as a cognitive bias, and we've got magnification, where you blow any negatives totally out of proportion. We've also got something that we see, or certainly the cognitive approach says that we see in depressed people, and that is personalization. You put the blame onto yourself. So you attribute any negative events that might be happening onto yourself, and you say it's my fault. Now that's that self-loathing, self-hating, isn't it? But this is suggesting that it's because of the way they're thinking that they have that self-loathing. So it's all because of the way we think that we develop this vulnerability to become depressed. Drawing conclusions on the basis of just one thing. So focusing just on the negative. Everybody hates me just because one person gave you a dodgy look. Or maybe they didn't, but your perception was that they did. Making sweeping conclusions over generalization. These are all little cognitive biases that we think somebody with depression has that's led them to have that disorder of depression. So remember that term, cognitive biases, and remember that name, Beck. And it all pieces together, because those cognitive biases lead you to have the way of thinking about the world that you do, and about yourself, and about your future. And if you're negatively thinking about all three of those, you're depressed, and that's what's caused your depression, this approach tells us. So I'm moving on from Beck. We need to remember Beck. We need to create a flashcard about Beck. But I'm moving on to Ellis. And the main thing that we need to remember Ellis for is the ABC model. And this again is on your knowledge organizer, and I've just given a snapshot. Now the A is the activating event. Something happens. And when we're talking about depression, we're usually thinking about a negative event. Now that could be something horrendous, like losing a loved one. It could be something much more minor, like not getting a great mark on a test, or falling out with a friend. And I know that's not minor, but you know, it might be if you're a teenager, you fall out with a friend one day and you make up with them the next day. But that is an activating event that for somebody who's got this irrational way of thinking can lead to catastrophic consequences. So we've got an A, an activating event. We've got our B, which is our beliefs. Now those beliefs can either be rational or they can be irrational. And then our C is consequence. The consequence of that, what does it lead to? What behavior will I therefore see? So this A, B, C, activating event, beliefs, consequence. I want you to see it as a worked example. And I chose something that I'm sure will be quite topical to many of you, because you'll be thinking about whenever this lockdown is over and things are safe again, you'll be thinking about learning to drive if you haven't already. So I've chosen the activating event is somebody has failed their driving test. Okay, hopefully that won't be you, but someone's failed their driving test. Now my person A on the left-hand side there is not depressed. They have rational thinking. So they fail their driving test. That's my activating event. The beliefs are, well, I'm really disappointed. It's a pain. I wanted to pass it. I can't really afford many more lessons, but I'll have another shot. I know I'll do better next time. I made some silly mistakes. I won't make those mistakes again. Lots of people don't pass first time. That's the beliefs. And what you do, because cognitive approach says that everything is shaped by your way of thinking, that way of thinking rationally, added together of the event of failing your driving test, leads you to the conclusion or to the consequence of, I'm going to book a few more lessons, I'm going to reapply for my test, and I'm going to get on with normal life. Let's have a look at person B though, because person B is somebody who we would say ends up with depression or symptoms that we would associate with depression. Exactly the same activating event. So we're not saying that bad things only happen to depressed people. We're saying the same event can happen to anybody, but what beliefs you have, what thinking you have, will determine what way that goes, will determine the consequence. So this person B, failed the driving test, but they've got in their head beliefs, their self-schema, their negative self-schema, really they think they're useless at everything, they can't do anything, they're a failure in life. They add that to the fact that they've failed their driving test. They think that's supporting evidence for all these negative thoughts that go on in their head. And the consequence for them is they cancel their social plans, they maybe lose their appetite, start skipping meals, they lose all motivation. And we would look at them, and if that was sustained over a period of time, we'd say they've got depression. And Ellis would say, yes, they have got depression, but it's not because they failed their driving test, it's because their way of thinking and interpreting events and responding to events is irrational. They have faulty thinking. And here we've got catastrophizing, we've got one small hiccup, you can resit it, it's not the end of the world, but no, it's a disaster. Everything about me is rubbish. We've got generalization, oversimplification, I'm a failure. And that's what leads to the depression. So says Beck and Ellis. And I hope you can see how, even though these are two different people, and Beck is associated with the negative triad, and Ellis is associated with this ABC model, the two things come together. We need to use Beck's ideas about cognitive bias and negative self-schema to make sense of Ellis's ABC model, because they all together represent the cognitive explanation of depression. Okay, so that's as much explanation as I'm going to give you in today's lesson. In terms of creating notes, hopefully, you're able to pause the video and jot down notes. In your textbook, it's page 148 in your online textbook. But also on the PowerPoint, you'll see there is a link to this video. Now, it's quite dry. It's probably not that different to what I've just given you. But in terms of consolidating, it might be quite useful. Leave this and then come back to it maybe in a few days' time. Just hear a different voice, and you might want to just listen through to that, which is just really a summary video. It's made specifically for your exam spec, so there's nothing in there that shouldn't be. There's nothing that will confuse you. Okay, so that's one little task to do, just to make sure you've got some good notes on this. Then I'd like you to make sure you get some flashcards created that you can keep testing yourself on. So I would suggest you have one on Ellis's ABC model, Beck's negative triad, the one general one, which would just be a bullet point list of some of these ideas we've explored today. So the general cognitive explanations, faulty thinking, negative self-schema, and so on. And one about cognitive biases. And I think give as many examples as you can, because if you were answering an exam question, I'd want you to be able to put in examples of cognitive biases that might lead somebody to depression. So magnification, minimization, personification, those sorts of things. Okay, so have a flashcard on that as well. Which draws me to the conclusion of this lesson. Quite short in a sense, but you've got that video clip to watch, which is quite lengthy, about 8 minutes. You'll want to keep pausing, taking notes. You'll want to read around in the textbook. So I think plenty of work to be getting on with. Make sure you're really secure in your idea of the cognitive approach and Ellis and Beck. On Friday, there's not going to be a video and there's not going to be a PowerPoint. I've put the instructions on Sims, which will be released later in the week. But what I'm actually going to ask you to do, because I think it's an appropriate time, we're going to put on hold our psychopathology work, and I'm going to ask you to spend Friday's lesson going back to the attachment topic, using your flashcards, using the retrieval packs that I gave you, using your notes, and just test yourself, check your knowledge, see where your gaps are, use the checklist, and spend as much time doing that as you need to. And by the end of half term week, so end of this week, all of next week, you decide the time. You sit down for half an hour, and I've shared with you on Sims an end of topic, attachment topic test. And I want you to have a go at it, and I want you to send it to me, and I'll do a full debrief after half term when I've got everybody's in. So take photos, email it through. Or you could even do it electronically. I know you wouldn't get to in an exam, but I wouldn't mind if you typed into the document and sent it back to me. It's a Word document, so you can. I know you might think, oh, miss, we're doing psychopathology. Now you want us to go back to attachment. This kind of spaced learning helps it stick. And I want you to just almost show yourself how much you know on the attachment topic, even though you haven't thought about it now for a good few weeks. Okay, so spend one lesson revising, reviewing, getting ready, then find a time within the next week and a half and complete the assessment. It's 24 marks and send it through to me. All right. So I should say good luck. If when you start doing that, you think, oh, I'm really unsure about this, drop me an email and I'm more than happy to help. Okay, right. When half term gets here, I hope you have a good one. Stay safe. I know the rules have been slightly relaxed, but I still don't think it's a very good idea for you to be arranging to meet up with friends. Anybody can get the disorder, this virus, just not worth the risk. So stay safe, guys. Stay sticking to the rules, and I will check in with you after half term. Okay, take care. Bye.